Hi everyone, welcome to tonight's webinar, the roadmap to electric vehicle adoption. Everyone, all the attendees are joining at the moment, so we're gonna just hold off on to start the webinar in a moment or two. Thanks for being here. This is a joint effort between the Sierra Club and Plug-in America. We're gonna be sharing details around our recently released Model EV Policy Toolkit. It's called Achieve. How to advance EV adoption at the state and local level. So we're just going to give it another moment. Thanks for waiting. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Hello everyone, this is Mary Lunetta with the Sierra Club's Electric Vehicles Initiative. Welcome to our webinar this evening entitled The Roadmap to Electric Vehicle Adoption, Model Policies and Programs to Accelerate EV Adoption at the state and local level. This is a joint effort between the Sierra Club and Plug-in America. Next slide, Kylie. So today, can you go back to the previous slide, please? Thanks. So tonight, I hope there's no background noise for me actually, because I just started noticing there's someone using power tools in my vicinity. So I apologize if you can hear that. I'll mute myself when I'm not talking. Anyways, to get back on track, I am Mary Lunetta. I'm the campaign representative for the Clean Transportation for All campaign with the Sierra Club, the National Sierra Club, and I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Catherine Stankin. She's the policy director at Plug-in America. And we also have our friend and colleague, Kylie from Plug-in America, who is running the back end of the webinar today. So thanks for your help, Kylie. Next slide. Thanks. So on today's agenda, we're going to be covering, well, why electric vehicles? Why are we working on this issue at all? And then we'll move into the toolkit, the Achieve Transition to EV Policy Toolkit 2.0, what we cover in the toolkit and how to use it. And then we will have a Q&A at the very end for about 15 to 20 minutes of the hour. However, you don't have to wait until then to share a question. If you have one coming up at any point during the presentation, just find the questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen where the webinar control panel is located. It's a pull-down box. Then once you find it, you can just type your question into the box and we can get to it at the end of the presentation. For any non-questions, like comments or information that you'd like to share, you can use the chat box located at the bottom of the control panel. It's also a pull-down tab. Everyone can go to the chat box right now, actually, to see a link that Kylie shared for accessing our toolkit online. Thanks for doing that, Kylie. And for any questions that we don't get to, don't worry, we will keep a record of all those questions and follow up with right afterwards. Next slide. Since we have folks from all backgrounds and all levels of expertise on the call, some of you work in EVs or the EV industry in some capacity, or you work on public policy, transportation policy. Some of you are volunteers and looking to be more active with the toolkit. We're all from different locations. So to bring us all up to speed and on the same level, this is a real brief review on common acronyms that we will use during this presentation. EVs stand for all electric vehicles. EVSE stands for electric vehicle supply equipment. That's basically charging equipment and all of the conduit and anything related to charging stations, EVSE. We also have HEVs, hybrid electric vehicles. Those are, powered by both conventional ICE is another acronym we'll get to in a second. So gas-powered cars, but also has an electric motor that uses in a stored battery. So those are HEVs. And then ICEs, for those of you that are not aware, ICE stands for internal combustion engines. Basically, conventional vehicles that run on gas. PEVs are plug-in electric vehicles, and they include EVs and plug-in hybrids. So PEVs are the umbrella term for both hybrids and full electrics. And PHEVs, the last acronym there, stands for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which is powered by an internal combustion engine as well as an electric motor, and it plugs into its energy source. So I hope that is helpful. But if you have any questions about any of the terms we use, feel free to put that into the questions box. Next slide, please. All right, so why electric vehicles at all? Well, in 2017, transportation became the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. Each year across the whole planet, about 3.5 million people die from air pollution, and 50% of these deaths are from air pollution caused by road transportation, with diesel vehicles being the biggest culprit. In the US alone, the cost of premature death by air pollution is $1.6 trillion. That's trillion with a T. So this problem is of massive scale and it must be addressed quickly. Next slide, please. Electric vehicles are one of the biggest solutions to air pollution caused by transportation. EVs have far lower emissions, up to 5 times lower than those ICE cars, regardless of how clean the electricity grid is that they're plugged into. They're much more affordable to fuel and maintain, and they're super fun. Just about everyone who test drives an EV for the first time says they love the feel of instant torque, and we're pleasantly surprised at how fun silent, zippy EV can be. So that is why we focus on EVs as a solution to this terrible pollution problem. Next slide. All right, Catherine.
Great. It's great to have everybody here with us tonight. I'm Catherine Stankin. I'm the Policy Director with Plug in America. So we're excited to be revealing to you the 2.0 version of this toolkit. And I just want to say a quick little disclaimer there too, that these policies already, they are so fluid and fast changing, and the EV sector is growing rapidly, and just transportation electrification in general. So if you see something in the toolkit that has already changed, please let us know, and we will update it for the 3.0 version that will come out when we have enough of these accumulated changes to the toolkit and new policies to tell you all about. So just wanted to throw that out there. So as Mary was just saying though about EVs, not everyone realizes the great benefits of the cars and other electric buses and trucks. And there are serious misperceptions about them, about the cost, about the range, about the charging, as you all know, as you host your National Drive Electric Week events, and you have people come up to you all the time asking really simple questions, and some asking questions that don't even have anything to do with electric vehicles. So in looking at all those barriers that we have listed here, the toolkit aims to address each of those kind of categories that we've got checked off. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so in our 1.0 version of the toolkit, we looked at some policies that really had the best kind of bang for the buck, so to speak. So we looked at big vehicle purchase rebates or tax credits, access to HOV lanes, etc. But we wanted to do focus on policies that are more for the local level or the community level. So we've expanded some of the categories to include ones on charging access, equity and access, consumer education and protection, and then just kind of highlighting some of the changes in the perks and incentives too, from the different from the 1.0 version. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, I have a lot of information to cover here and only a couple examples there, so bear with me. So this category of policies, purchase rebates, tax credits, and HOV lanes, is all kind of about making it more attractive for a consumer to go electric, either by reducing the cost of the vehicle or providing that extra little perk to make the switch. So as we move into the mass market stage and the greater consumer adoption, this is probably the category of policies that's going to change the most and likely phase out over time. But for now, for most states, we definitely need these policies. I think probably everybody on the call is aware of if your state has a purchase incentive or not, and the tax credits that are available, including the federal tax credits. And again, these are still really big incentives that are important to help move the needle forward. And I know that there are some efforts out there to, in terms of the rebate funding pots, there'll be efforts going on into the fall and then into next year, 2019, to up those rebate pots of money. So if you're interested in getting involved in your state's effort for that, let me know and we can connect you to the right people. But even with the rebate, I mean, even some drivers view that as a way to offset the cost of the charging station equipment. So it's still, even though the EVs are coming down in cost, we still need incentives like this to help those of lower income be able to make the switch to drive electric. There are some states that are still even pursuing this kind of a rebate program. So Georgia, this year, there was an effort to bring back the EV tax credit for $2,500 that did get a lot of traction actually in the House before some larger level politics got in the way there. And in Washington state, there was definitely support to extend the sales tax exemption. The state hit their cap, I think it was back in May and June. And there's definitely efforts underway to keep that going into next year. So to make the funding last longer though, some of the states are now looking at including an MSRP cap. So usually something around 50 to 60K is what most states that have an MRCP cap now, that's what other states are considering. So that's just kind of to help ensure that the rebate isn't going to someone wealthy. And in California, there's a bill pending in the legislature that prioritizes rebates to go to low income customers in order to maximize the funding pot there. So we'll start to see tweaks like this with some of these purchase incentives. The last example there on the page or on the slide is about Tennessee, and it's on the HOV lanes. So I don't think we've seen too many changes in HOV lane policy this year, except in California, where the policy transitioned to be a rolling 3-year decal program. So if you drive electric, you don't get unlimited access to the HOV lane anymore. You only get it for 3 years. And that's only if the car has not ever had a sticker or decal or whatever assigned to it. So we at Plug in America don't particularly think that that's a great policy, just because a person in the used car market buying a used EV won't ever get access to the HOV lane. And so that kind of impacts the low income customers a bit more. And so we're definitely working to try to change that or modify it at least to let the battery electric cars in for a longer period of time, but that's an ongoing effort. But anyway, I mean, all the HOV programs, they'll end in 2025 regardless, because of it's the FAST Act, which is a federal policy that had only enabled states to allow for HOV access for EVs. And that was only given until 2025. So come that time, the federal government can either extend to, they can choose to extend that policy or just not allow access anymore. Let's go to the next slide.
All right, thanks, Catherine. So advocating for the electrification of public fleets is a really effective way to put the importance of prioritizing clean transportation and zero emission transportation right into the public spotlight. Because electricity is roughly 1/4 the cost of gasoline per mile, and because EVs require much less service, the city of Seattle determined it would save $2 million over the course of 10 years if it purchased 300 Nissan Leafs instead of hybrids for its passenger fleet vehicles, city fleet vehicles. And the savings would be more than $3 million compared to ICE vehicles. These savings are looking more and more attractive to major transit agencies as well. So in DC, the circulator transit bus system that DC has, they just adopted 14 fully electric buses, with more expected soon. And Los Angeles County Metro has deployed 95 electric buses into their transit fleet and have also committed to a 100% electric fleet by 2030. They have, I think the majority of their buses fleets at the moment are CNG, so they'll be replacing CNG buses. New York State also offers vouchers to public, private, and nonprofit fleets for the purchase of all electric city vehicles, or not, I'm sorry, not city vehicles, but any vehicles that those public, private, or nonprofit fleets use, if they're in use 70% of the time. And there are other examples of model programs underway at the moment for electrifying vehicle fleets that we cover in the toolkit. So check it out for more examples there. Next slide, please. So expanding charging access. Owners of ICE cars have many options when it comes to finding a gas station to fuel up at, but for people who drive electric cars, fueling happens differently, whether it's at home or at work, traveling or running errands. That's why as the growth of electric mobility continues to gain this really exciting momentum, the need for large-scale charging networks is becoming even more pressing. Just as there are many stakeholders and policy pathways on the journey to expand EV charging and remove the institutional barriers that we are currently faced with, there are also just as many unique needs and challenges facing our communities when it comes to charging our EVs. So some cities are adopting building codes and passing ordinances requiring new homes, buildings, and parking structures be EV ready, having the conduit and wiring in place to accommodate EV charging. In Atlanta, Georgia, I think it was last year, they passed an ordinance that requires all new residential homes and public parking facilities to accommodate electric vehicles, with 20% of the spaces in all new commercial and multifamily parking structures be EV ready. And that was one of the more aggressive EV ready ordinances that we know of. Washington State, they require 5% of parking spaces in new buildings to be equipped with EV charging infrastructure. And the electrical room also has to be designed to accommodate 20% of all parking spaces to be EV ready. And in Palo Alto, I forget when they passed this, but we do link to it in our toolkit. It requires all new single family residences and commercial buildings, which includes multi-unit dwellings, as well as mixed use facilities and hotels, to be EV ready. So it's also a very aggressive, forward moving EV ready policy there in Palo Alto. Next slide, please. One of the really great resources included in our toolkit are the many policy templates that we provide, which can be downloaded and customized to fit your community. Here is what our template for the EVSE installation MUDs looks like. The templates that we provide in the toolkit are really easy to customize. It's easy to process, and it's really helpful for getting the conversation going with your legislator or your public official that you're in communication with. Next slide.
Okay, great. It's back to me. So we could not talk about policy and electric vehicles without bringing up EVs and utility investments, because this is a huge force that's coming. Right now, there's a lot of utilities out there that have pilot programs, but we're seeing more and more every day. There are more and more states and utilities popping up with more pilot programs or larger filing. And we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars here. So we've seen some recent utilities in New Jersey put forward $300 million worth of projects. And in California, we've also got nearly $1 billion that was just approved. And even today, I think I saw $55 million for another separate filing. So this is really critical to be kind of just aware of what's going on and to understand how you might fit in the role here too. So when we're talking about utilities, and I guess for the most part, we're referring to some of the bigger investor-owned utilities here and the regulators. But we could also mention that this also applies to your municipal utilities or your local co-ops too, because we want them to be involved in the EV sector and be aware of charging loads and charging patterns and things like that too. But first things first, so this is not on the slide, but sometimes you do need some legislation to allow for a utility to get involved in the fuller transportation electrification sector or to do EV programs and whatnot. And there are a few states like California, Oregon, and Massachusetts that have legislation like that, and that's linked in the toolkit. And that does allow utility to then move forward with these bigger EV filings at their state commission. But other states, what we've seen so far is that they've started a stakeholder process to allow the utilities to start engaging in the conversation, at least with other stakeholders and necessary parties. And then those stakeholder processes have then kind of moved into smaller EV pilot programs. So that's kind of what this slide is geared towards. So if you were going to be doing some outreach to your regulators or the folks that are doing EV programs or in charge of the EV piece of the utility at the muni or the co-op, this is kind of what you would want to get across to them. So first there, we say support the EV conversation among key stakeholders. So the first thing is to get everybody in the room and create that venue for the EV conversation to happen. So bring together folks from the transportation sector, the consumer protection sphere, different energy and environmental groups, and start to discuss the key issues before you get into some kind of a bigger contested case where the utility is trying to get your program approved. It's also really helpful if the parties that are coming to this conversation have already agreed on some of the bigger picture items. And to that end, I'll just mention that there's this transportation electrification accord out there, and you can Google it and look up the transportation electrification accord. So if you're a city captain, but you also represent an environmental NGO or another business that's related to the EV world, you might want to consider signing that transportation electrification accord. It's for businesses and groups, but it's not for individuals. Secondly, we want the regulators and folks to be starting to support the planning for an EV future or for the larger transportation electrification portfolio. So a lot of times, National Drive Electric Week is really focused on the light duty vehicle, but we want to start encouraging people to think bigger picture about some of the forklifts and the buses and things like that that are going to be electric. So this kind of understands then what the opportunities are with EVs, that they can be a flexible grid resource, that they can soak up extra solar generation, that kind of thing. Third, we suggest that the regulators then identify and resolve key issues that will define utility and market roles. So for the most part, this is kind of, most states have actually already discussed this, which is deciding really if the charging station should be considered a utility or not a utility. And I think most states have decided that the charging stations are not utilities because they're not generating electricity in the traditional sense of a utility. They're just passing through the electricity. So that would kind of be the equivalent of if every outlet had to be considered a utility and get approval. And it's just, yeah, it's a conversation that needed to happen, and now the regulators have done that and understood the issues, and now moving on to the bigger picture items. But we felt it was still important to mention. Fourth, the regulators need to identify and resolve key issues around the role of utility and consumer protection. We have a slide on this that's next, actually, so I'll touch on that in a second. And finally, we want regulators to approve reasonable utility EV charging investment programs that are in the public interest. So really this is relating to that infrastructure support. And we just, as I'm mentioning, we saw some big programs recently approved in California that supports this charging infrastructure. And now they're going a step further and supporting the infrastructure for school buses and for other types of DC fast charging. And last, just to note about the utilities too, I know this is an effort that Sierra Club is picking up on, but it's great to have utilities as your ally in promoting EV policy. So if you haven't ever thought of reaching out to your local utility to get them to sign on to your resolution about National Drive Electric Week and to have them help you promote it, I highly suggest that you do so, because utilities pretty much love electric vehicles because it represents more load for them and opportunities for new revenue streams. So I would I just suggest reaching out to them and, to be an ally in your advocacy efforts. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so consumer education and protection. This should probably be an area that you're all very familiar with, being EV drivers yourselves, or I'm guessing the majority of you are EV drivers. So in terms of the public outreach and education, we've got ride and drives, we've got EV proclamations, end-do events, ribbon cuttings, and then the EV driver Bill of Rights. So this is linked in the toolkit, and I have some updated language on that EV driver Bill of Rights that we'll provide to folks too. But that's just a good way to get some PR out there for EVs or for your event, or to get support from your local community for EVs. So that's that category. Now we'll get into the trickier issues of consumer protection, which is dealing with issues like open access, interoperability, and uniform signage requirements. These are topics that haven't been addressed in many states to date, really just in California so far. So California, and there's an example there on the slide that California passed SB 454, which is the Electric Vehicle Charging Stations Open Access Act. And this deals with a lot of different topics about pricing transparency and having access to the station, making sure it's not behind a locked gate or something like that. And then there's billing interoperability, so you can show up to the station and be able to charge via a credit card method or a mobile option or something like that. So the regulations for this are only now being thought through at the California Air Resources Board. So when that's finalized, we will definitely be linking to that in the 3.0 version of the toolkit. So for now, stay tuned for that. But I would say that most states will probably need to pass some kind of supporting legislation first to be able to adopt the regulations that California comes up with. So New Hampshire is an example of a different policy there that addresses some consumer protection issues. So you might want to take a look at that. And finally, on the signage requirements, this is often kind of a very overlooked policy, but it's really important. So on the toolkit, I didn't go into this on the slide, but in the toolkit, we linked to the federal policy and then some state and then local policies too. So really only on the federal level, if there's been a federal highway or a corridor that's been designated as an alternative fuel corridor, then there's specific guidance on what that signage should look like. But if it's not one of those corridors and it's just a state highway, a local road or something, the FHWA does provide some interim interim approved guidance on what that signage should look like. And then they also provide guidance on what standardized parking signs should look like. So I would encourage you to take a look at what Washington State has done. I think that that's really thoroughly thought out, and these signs are pretty clear to understand what the color of the sign needs to be and all kinds of things. But also look at the guidance from the California PEV Collaborative, which we have linked there too. Let's go to the next slide. Back to you, Mary.
Well, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, so this is on expanding equity and access. So though EV deployment has really increased in recent years, people from disadvantaged communities are actually more likely to encounter the strongest barriers to EV adoption. For low-income families, the $7,500 federal tax credit doesn't fully remove the economic barrier that many low-income people face when buying or leasing their next car, because the credit is only applied if a person has the tax liability. Many low-income people and families do not have that liability. They can access it theoretically if they lease, but it's not always guaranteed that the financing company will pass on the savings to the consumer. So disadvantaged communities also face challenges to charging access as they are less frequently homeowners and are often, they often live in multi-unit dwellings, MUDs, which don't often have dedicated charging spaces, at least not unless they're a new MUD or multi-unit dwelling, beholden to some of the exciting EV-ready ordinances we covered earlier. Disadvantaged communities also typically experience more severe health impacts from vehicle tailpipe emissions because they're often located near the major roadways, highways, and transportation hubs like transit depots or idling stations. And since emissions increase the risks of asthma, cancer, and other pollution-related illnesses, low-income and communities of color suffer disproportionately from the rest of us because of the dirty transportation emissions that they are exposed to. In order to accelerate a mass transition to zero-emission vehicles across the country, they will have to be more accessible and affordable for disadvantaged communities. States, cities, and utilities are encouraged to adopt programs that increase electric transportation for all communities because everyone deserves to breathe clean air and access clean transportation choices, regardless of their income or their location. California is leading these efforts, with Oregon following close behind. In California, they have the Clean Vehicle Assistance Program, which helps low to moderate income residents with grants of up to $5,000, which can be put towards buying a new or used plug-in hybrid or electric vehicle. In Oregon, also in California, I'll just jump down to keep it in California. San Diego has their utility, SDG&E. They have a Power Your Drive program where they install, well, one of the things that they do is install charging stations in the community, and they waive charging installation fees if the installation is going in an underserved community. So essentially it's a free charging station if there's any interest in that from one of those communities. Also in Los Angeles, this is a little bit of a different program area, but that's where they operate. It's called Blue LA. Blue LA is an electric car sharing program, which is really cool and exciting, very forward thinking, which allows people to use a car that they don't own, but they can use based on the time that they have it for. And I believe there's no requirement to leave it where they got it. So they can pick it up in one neighborhood and drop it off in another neighborhood. And it's affordable and fully electric. So that's a really good option for people who can't afford buying a full car, afford buying or leasing an electric car on their own. And in Oregon, this is really new. I think it's only a couple months old. They now offer a rebate of up to $2,500 for a new EV or plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, and an additional $2,500 for low-income drivers to buy new or used EV or plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. So really exciting stuff there. Next slide. A section of our toolkit covers EV registration fees, which is an emerging trend at the state level. Since the start of 2017, I think we're at 12 states that have introduced legislation that would require EV drivers to pay hundreds per year in registration fees, annual registration fees. The stated reason for this revenue is that these funds would help close the gap in transportation budget shortfalls that so many states are faced with, but the projected revenue from EVs is super minimal. It's in the tens to hundreds of thousands a year, since EVs represent a low amount of total auto registrations at the state level, often just under 1% for most states. And even in California, where EVs are the most prevalent, there's still only 3% or so of vehicles on the road. Most state highway funds have budget gaps in the millions to tens of millions, sometimes hundreds of millions. So revenue from these fees would be no more than a drop in the bucket. We have an EV fee fact sheet that we can share with you if you'd like to learn more about this. It's also included in the toolkit, but Kylie, can you share a link to that in the chat box? And then if anyone can't see the chat box, let me know in the questions, just to get a sense of things. Or if you can see the chat box, because as organizers, we have a little bit of a different view from the audience. So if you are able to see the chat box and use it, can you just let me know either in the questions or in the chat box, just so I have a sense of that. Thanks so much. Anyways, back to the slide. So according to the map, if you are in a gray state or a green state, because these fights can come up again. If you're in one of those green or gray states, start early, take our fact sheet, get some friends, get some partners, and go visit a public official, an elected official, and let them know why EV fees are really bad policy on a number of fronts. There's a few notes on the slide where it mentions funded by Koch brothers oil and gas lobby, and I just want to mention that there was a New York Times piece that came out a couple of years ago. At this point now, it's been a couple of years, when these fees first started showing up. And it was a research piece that looked into who's backing these efforts. And it looks like it's the Koch brothers. So if you'd like more information on that, go ahead and reach out to me and I can share links to the news articles that we have. Next slide.
Great.
All right, Catherine, over to you.
Great. So we're almost done here, just a few more slides, then we'll get into our Q&A. So just on how to use the Achieve toolkit, we've used this slide before, this little diagram here. So the first things first, definitely research your community, your city, your state, region, etc., your specific needs. So, you know, you can look at the categories of policies that we have. Do you have enough on charging access? Do you have enough on vehicle purchase incentives? That kind of thing. And whatever you don't have, then start to, you know, work through the boxes about what you might need. Next is to then meet with your local elected officials. And we are always saying this, I think, but it's important to hear it nonetheless, that they work for you. They want to be elected the next time around. And so they are definitely open to having a meeting with you to talk about electric vehicles and the policy and the changing, you know, transportation sector. I think that that's, if you could come in and educate them on that, that would be great. Then, you know, gives them material for their next speech or for talking to somebody new in a new business. So we highly encourage you to meet with your local elected officials. And then for purposes of moving policy, then download some of the templates that we have in the toolkit and fill it in for your area, for your community, for your state. And then you can present that to your local elected official, and then that'll be a great jumping off point to go into, you know, how would this actually look, or how would it work, or etc. And then finally start to build your campaign around whatever you know, piece of legislation or policy item that you're working towards, and get some other stakeholders on board. Like we mentioned, the utilities are allies more often than not with EVs, and so they're great ones to have on hand. Just a quick note too, in the toolkit we also had some other charging access programs linked, which I think that we forgot to put the slide on in, or maybe somehow that got taken out, but that was on the streetlight charging and the right-of-way charging programs, which are right now, they are just programs. It's not necessarily a policy. Those are more public-private partnerships in Seattle and in Los Angeles. So as the market moves forward, though, I could for sure see something like, you know, all the streetlights on Main Street must be or must offer EV charging at least at 120 volts or something like that. I can see that morphing into that kind of a policy. And in fact, just a few days ago, Southern California Edison, a really big utility in Southern California, they have a curbside charging program that they are looking to get approval on. So that would be huge for all of the drivers who live at multi-unit dwellings and don't have garages or even a designated parking lot, really. So that's a really big policy that we see, you know, will make a lot of headway in the next year. And then also with the right-of-way charging program, that's something in, I guess that's the curbside charging program as well. You could call it either thing, but that's big in Seattle and New Orleans. And I know that Philadelphia did recently have a pretty successful program, but that too many non-EV drivers were complaining about the parking spots being blocked. So they did away with their program. But again, that curbside program, the right-of-way charging program, I think that that'll start to make a bigger impact as more and more people are switching to electric. So just keep your eyes on that. Let's go to the next slide.
So actually, Kylie, I'm going to ask you to go back 2 slides to the registration fees with the map. There's something I forgot to mention. So I forgot to clarify what the color coding is. It's actually listed there, but it's super tiny. You probably can't read it. So all the states that are in red are states that have passed an EV fee of some sort at some level, or like in California's case, they're committing to having one go into effect by a certain year in the near future. So those are the states where we now have EV fees, and in the last 2 years, this number has doubled from where it was 2 years before. So this is a rapidly increasing situation. With the green states are states that have deferred the EV fee, or they've rejected a proposal to have an EV fee. And that kind of depends on, you know, what's going on in that state, who is backing it, all that. There's a lot of different factors that go into why they said no to an EV fee. But those are the states that have said no. And then the fees or the states that are in gray have not yet had this issue come up that we are aware of. And the states that are orange were considering an EV fee at the time that this map was made, which was actually back in April. So it's a few months old. It's not the most accurate, but it's a pretty good snapshot of where we're at. So in summary, if you live in a state that is not red, then you can still engage on this issue in some way, and we encourage you to do so. Another big reason why EV fees are a bad idea is because they're not fair. The whole justification for them is to close those budget gaps that fund states' highways and roads, which have typically been funded by gas taxes. On average, the median annual gas tax is $71 a year that an individual would pay. The median proposed EV fee is higher than that. The median is $123, with many of them higher than that. So it's not comparable. It's not fair that this burden would be put on EV drivers than drivers of ICE vehicles. So that's another reason why it's not fair. But that's also talked about in the EV fact sheet. So thank you for bearing with me as I revisited that slide. I just wanted. Okay. Thank you.
We just lost you, but you're back.
Okay. Yeah, so why now? Well, we believe the transportation sector will change rapidly more in the next 10 years than it really has in the last 50. We are heading towards cleaner cars, trucks, and buses with huge benefits for our air, our climate, and the quality of life. But transitions will only happen fast enough and in the right ways if we successfully push for strong programs and good policy. Two key things will move the EV market in the United States. Number one, events like National Drive Electric Week that expose the public to these really cool cars. And number two, EV policies that will make EVs more accessible to more people. We really need all hands on deck. That means all of you and all of us to organize events and really push for these strong EV policies at the state, local, and even national levels. And with that, Catherine and I will turn to all of you for questions in the question box. So if you haven't submitted a question yet, now's your time to do so. And I will take a quick look. Let me see what is good. Okay, so Samantha, I'll just take the first one, and then me and Catherine will kind of volley back and forth and see, what we want to do in terms of responding. Jump in anytime, Catherine. So Samantha asks a really good question. How do electric vehicles promote local jobs? We mentioned that in one of our earlier slides, and that's a super good question. For more information, I would just direct you or anyone interested in this to the Blue Green Alliance. If you Google them, you'll find a whole bunch of more information on this. But just off the top of my head, electric vehicles offer local jobs through a number of ways. Number one, through manufacturing. There's many states all across the country manufacture electric or vehicles in general, and among those, electric cars. So there's a lot of that manufacturing. There's also the maintenance of electric vehicles. There's the whole world associated with EV charging, from installing charging stations to maintaining them, which is sometimes through utility companies as well. So there's a lot of jobs associated with utilities. And then there's the EV sales, selling the cars, letting people know about them, and answering people's questions. And then tangentially, there's the whole solar industry, which has a really strong symbiotic relationship with electric cars. Catherine, is there anything else you wanted to add to that question?
Yeah, I mean, with the manufacturing, for sure, not all of the cars are made in the USA. But with the battery components, I mean, batteries are really heavy. So more often than not, the battery might be the final piece put in the vehicle, wherever that is. So it's more, and some of that is automated, so it's not necessarily a job. But there are a high number of cars that are pieces and parts of the cars that are made in the United States. And I believe the Electric Drive Transportation Association did a report on that looked at the percentage of cars being made in the United States versus some other countries.
That's a really good point. I forgot about the batteries. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so moving along, Jim asks, what do you recommend for kilowatt levels for DC rapid charge stations for public use? Future cars are transitioning from 50 kilowatts an hour to 150, and some are going as high as 350 kilowatts an hour, as in Europe. Okay, so I am not a utility, or I'm not like, this is not my expertise. Maybe, what do you have to say, Catherine? Do you have a response for Jim on this question?
Yes, let me pull up my battery fact sheet. I don't know if we have a recommended super fast, like high level, like super high charging recommendation yet for public chargers. I mean, I think most people need to understand right now that it's not exactly a apples to apples comparison of fueling with gas to charging your vehicle. And certainly some skeptics out there say, well, if you don't have that minute or 2-minute time it takes to fill your car or charge your car, like it's never gonna, the industry won't ever take off fully. I think, there's a lot of other pros to EVs of the convenience of charging at home and the reduced maintenance costs and things like that that still work in the favor of the EV market. But I guess short answer, like, no, we don't have a recommended level for the super fast chargers yet.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Gregory asks, what requirements are there for existing buildings? I guess that's in response to our slides on EV ready ordinances. So off the top of my head, I'm just going to say that I don't know of any requirements for existing buildings, because new buildings, new structures are easy to manage in terms of what is new codes that they should be following. But am I wrong on that, Catherine, or are there any requirements for existing buildings when it comes to EVs?
I think only in the sense that, I have to think about that for a second, but I mean, if you're, for example, if you're in California and you're adopting the Cal Green code, which requires, I think it's like 5% of parking spaces to be EVSE ready right now, and they might increase that to 10% or 20%. But unless your building decides to be like LEED certified or claim that it's meeting all the requirements of the Cal Green code, then then they would want to update to the latest version of the code, which then would include higher requirements and whatnot. But I don't, I mean, most buildings I don't think would do that.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. Okay, thanks. Okay, so moving forward, let's see. John has a question regarding priorities. Does Plug in America or Sierra Club have policy priorities? For example, uniform anti-ice laws, vis-a-vis making a new construction being EV ready by way of extend, or compared to the extending the federal tax credit. Okay, so I'm gonna take a stab at this, and I'm gonna pass it over to you, Catherine, to speak for Plug in America. But so in terms of our priorities, when it comes to which policies and programs we push, it really depends on what state or community we're looking at. Every state and every community is different and has different needs and different political landscapes that allow for different things. Nonetheless, we know which types of policies and programs will be the biggest drivers of mass EV adoption. Of course, the federal credit and defending that credit, extending that credit is number one. But so is signing on to California's zero emission vehicle or ZEV mandate. There are, how many states is it? Like 10 or 11 states have 9?
Yeah,
okay.
9.
I'm always forgetting.
That have the ZEV mandate piece. There are 13 that have the LEV requirements.
Right, totally. Okay, yeah. So they're in total, with California included, there are 10 states that require EVs are made available in their state and sell in their state. So automakers are beholden to that. And that's a huge driver. That's the number one catalyst to seeing EVs on the roads is states that have signed on to that rule. Also charging access. If you build it, or you install it, they will come. That's a big rule. And so we have to always prioritize charging access and building out charging access. And then also just rebates and incentives. Whenever there is a state rebate or some sort of incentive of some sort, that's when we see major EV adoption. What that looks like, what the rebates are, or the incentives are, or the charging policies, that depends on what state and what town or what city we're looking at. That all is dependent upon the needs and the issues that are very local and unique to that area. Do you have anything that you wanted to add, Catherine?
I mean, I think for our policy priorities, the federal tax credit, that just 30D credit, and then there's also a 30C credit, which is on the fueling infrastructure property, so aka charging stations. That's for sure our #1 policy priority, because we're the voice of the driver, and that credit works for all states. Well, it doesn't work for every single driver. You don't have tax liability, but pretty much, any policy like that will move the market forward. So I mean, Mary was mentioning a bunch of them, but they're all the ones that are mentioned in this toolkits are ones that we would support. I don't know if we have necessarily a top 10 list of do this first and then do the next one and then on down the list. But it's also very state specific about the political atmosphere in that state and the number of cars on the road currently.
Right, like having an ICE ban considered in Oklahoma, Missouri, Mississippi, probably not really a good idea. But having an ICE ban get discussed and considered or possibly announced in California might be really powerful and effective in some way. So that's just the kind of situations that are important, is considering where we're looking at and what goes into that state. Okay, so next question, let me just look here. Okay, John asks, any suggestions for a point of contact at utilities? What would you suggest, Catherine?
I would probably go to their website first and Google EVs and whatever local utility you have. If it's a big utility, I probably have a contact there, so maybe leave your email in the chat contact there, and I can send you an introduction email or something. But for sure, just start with whomever is doing more of the customer engagement programs, because EVs are usually more on the customer engagement side right now with education and awareness, and they're not so much on the system planning team at a utility, although they should be. So I would, start with customer engagement type programs. And if you don't, if there doesn't, whomever is running the solar program at a utility or running the energy efficiency program, if it's at a small utility, that person might be double or triple tasked with the solar and the EV programs too. So I would start with those.
Thank you. Here's a question from Clyde. Has the EV industry standardized the plugs for charging stations? I actually don't know the answer to that question. Do you, Catherine?
No, they have not. I don't know if they ever will, but wouldn't that be wonderful? But those are big automaker decisions at the moment. But there's for sure standardization coming in terms of the labeling and the requirements of what needs to be made public on the station with total cost or demand charges or things like that, but not the plugs itself.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so here is the next question. It's a question about HR 6274, which extends rebates to Tesla and Chevy after they hit the 200,000 mark with selling EVs. I don't work on this at all. Do you happen to have an answer that you can provide about this, Catherine?
I do not. I don't know who sponsored that, but I would say about the federal tax credit, if you're interested in that the chance for working on extending that would probably come after the election this year. So probably sometime later in November and in December when we get into the lame duck session. And if it doesn't happen then we've got a new Congress coming in 2019. So depending on how things go, and it's not that we, I mean, there are many Republicans that are supportive of extending the tax credit. It's more of the work that was done on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act on the House side that is kind of a limiting factor maybe in getting the EV credit extended, because there's just that general philosophy out there to, you know, cut tax credits, and this is a tax credit, so it's high on their radar. But we are definitely working with other groups to extend and lift that cap.
Yeah, okay, cool, that was very helpful. A question here is, where can I get the toolkit you're referring to? So if you look on your control panel for the webinar and you go down to the chat pull down menu, you should see a link to it right there. If not, we will share it with you, right, with everyone after the webinar, along with maybe a couple other resources that we mentioned. So just stay tuned. Let's see here. I'm trying to look through the questions, find something that's good. This is a good question. I like this question by Ronald. Is Sierra Club or Plug in America working to tap into the Volkswagen Dieselgate funds to help incentivize electric school buses? Yes, very much so. This is actually one of the major projects I work on with the Sierra Club. So I lead the Sierra Club's national Volkswagen settlement advocacy work with all of our chapters. We have chapters in every state, and for those of you not familiar with the Volkswagen settlement, I won't go into too much information because I could have a whole webinar, and we do on that issue alone, but every state is receiving quite a large sum of money from Volkswagen through the settlement to invest in zero emission, or clean rather, transportation, which can include electric transportation like school buses, as well as transit buses and other investment opportunities. There is a lot underway to incentivize electric school buses. Some examples are in Vermont. Vermont has committed in their VW plan to purchase electric school buses. So has Rhode Island. Rhode Island has done that. Oregon is looking at replacing 450 school buses with the fuel type unspecified. It could go in the direction of electric. It could also go in propane, which is a big competitor. So if anyone on this call is interested in getting more involved in advocacy at your state level to use your state's funds to invest in electric transportation, please reach out to me. Actually, Kylie, if you can just move to the next, oh no, we're already on the next slide. Okay, so my contact information is there. Mine is mary.lunetta@sierraclub.org. Feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer your questions and connect you with other folks that are working to influence their state's VW plan, because it's a lot of money that could go towards electric school buses. Good question. Thanks, Ronald. Let's see what else. What is an ICE ban? Barbara asks. Oh, good question. Okay, so ICE, if you recall from our earlier slide, stands for internal combustion engine, and an ICE ban would mean that if a state passes it, then that means that in that state they won't allow internal combustion engines or conventionally powered cars through gas to be sold in that state. No more new cars. That basically all new cars sold, all new light duty passenger vehicles would have to be electric or hybrid. Do I have that right, Catherine? Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, or you could also do it by limiting the sales, or with the registrations of new cars that they have to be only electric. And so that was the subject of much discussion in California at the beginning of the year with Assemblyman Ting. He had a bill that was, I guess this was last session. I don't know if he ever fully put it forward this one, or continuation from last session, but he was looking at doing that by 2040 to phase out the registration of gas vehicles. So this is, other countries have done similar things. It's been more the cities that prohibit diesel cars or gas vehicles from coming into the city, like Paris and London have done similar things like that. But I don't think that any country has yet fully, maybe Norway, fully banned the gas car.
Aha. Cool. Okay, that's very helpful. And with that, it looks like we are now at the top of the hour. We didn't get to all the questions, but we are happy to follow up with you all afterwards. So if your question didn't get answered, then stay tuned. We'll circle back with you, I'm sure. Thank you so much for joining us on today's webinar. We hope you found it informative, and we hope to hear from you all soon about how
Thank
your
you.
events are going and all your efforts are going locally. Take care. Have a good night. Bye-bye.